jump in. Thanks, Mark, for recording. And we have, it looks like two main items on the agenda tonight. We have Dr. Cameron Jack, who is an assistant professor in entomology, and he's going to be talking to us about honeybee toxicology. If you recall, several meetings ago, we had brought that up as a potential topic for a meeting. So Cameron's been nice enough to join us today. And then after that, Gus is back with us to give us an update, I suppose, on the zero waste procurement policy that is part of the zero waste strategy report, and that we've consulted with him on in previous meetings. So he's going to update us on that. Before we jump into to Dr. Jack's talk, is there any items on the agenda that anybody wants to revise or change, or anything to do with the agenda or the minutes before we start?
Hey, Nisha, really quick, because now Mark can hear me. Somehow my communication with Mark doesn't work anymore. I didn't get the agenda at all. And I've noticed the last couple of times, I think he doesn't get my minutes. So Mark, can you put me back on the email list? I didn't get an agenda.
You didn't get one to Jay?
No, I didn't get one. So something, I don't know, somehow something is not right with our connection. Just FYI.
Okay, I'll resend it. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Okay, anyone else?
Yeah, Nisha, my hand is raised.
Oh yeah.
I had submitted late today a document for EPAC members to read. I don't know if you had a chance to get to it, but we may want to discuss it if there's some time before the end of the meeting. This is a very good breakdown by the CCAC group, and they kind of itemized different things that they felt were, would be of importance, during the climate change, a period of time of climate change, when it gets more, shall we say, disastrous, or that's nature. So if there's time, if we can discuss that, please do, and we can add that to the agenda.
Sure. And that was sent out today. I don't see it in my inbox.
I sent it about an hour ago, maybe.
Okay. Let's see.
It's got an Excel spreadsheet attachment.
All right. Well, yeah. I'll look in my inbox, see if I can find it. I don't see it right away, but yeah, we can definitely add that on, time permitting, and if it's still timely at this next meeting, and we want to, add it to the next meeting's agenda, we can do that also. So let's go ahead and get started. So Dr. Jack, why don't you introduce yourself, and you can go ahead and get started.
Mind if I see? I've got screen sharing capabilities here. 1 second. Let me share the screen. But first of all, thank you for inviting me today. Can you all see?
Yeah.
You see that? You're seeing the right screen, not the note screen?
The right screen.
Yes. Okay, good. Yes. Sometimes it gets mixed. So anyways, I appreciate you all inviting me. This is this is a great opportunity to talk. I talk about honeybees all the time, every day. I just love it. So this is always good for me, but this is kind of a specific area that is a little bit more focused, and to be honest, there's so much work here that is done around toxicology with bees in general, and then when you add neonicotinoids to it, we're talking about decades and decades of research here. So I'm going to do my best to kind of give you what I think is a good overview of how toxicology works, and we'll spend a little bit of time just talking specifically about neonicotinoids, but I want to make sure I try to leave some time for questions, because I know there will be things that come up, and I'm not going to touch, obviously I can't boil down decades of work into 30 minutes and cover everything. So, but just to give you a little bit more about me. So I've been actually at UF as a faculty member in the entomology and nematology department for 3 years, but back in July, I just started an assistant professor position. Before that, I was 100% teaching. I was just a lecturer teaching a lot of bee courses and creating more, or like a beekeeping program. You know, you can come to UF and study anything you want. If you want to do horticulture, you take a bunch of horticulture classes and you go into that industry. If you want to do cattle production, you do a bunch of courses, go do an internship and go into the industry. Well, there's like nothing like that for honeybees really anywhere in the world. You know, or at least anywhere in the United States, where you can just take like a whole curriculum of beekeeping related courses and go into that industry. So that's kind of what I've been tasked with doing. And it's been a lot of fun. I'm still teaching all those courses, but now I have a research component as well. So just to kind of give you a quick overview of what I teach, you know, so these courses are all new in the last 3 years. We've built them along with, there's another honeybee researcher here at UF named Jamie Ellis, and kind of he and I, with a team of some different people, have kind of built all these courses. I also teach a study abroad in Asia, in Thailand, where we can go look at honeybee diversity. And there's courses related to the commercial aspect. There's courses related to the biology aspect. And I am also teaching, this is a new insect toxicology course. So this is kind of new for me. And I've done a lot, my PhD work was, you know, related to honeybee toxicology. I wouldn't consider myself a toxicologist, but when the job came open and I applied and they asked me, "Are you a toxicologist?" I said, "Of course I am." So, so now I'm trying to really learn to be a toxicologist really quick, and trying my best to learn. So if I can't answer any of your questions tonight, I will do my best to figure out the answer and let you know later. But bear with me as I'm becoming a toxicologist. Okay. Really quick, just, you know, I do have a 30% research. As I said, most of my work is focused on honeybees, and primarily, you know, I do a lot with chemicals and chemistries, but it's mostly focused on controlling honeybee pests. So if you've know a little bit about honeybees, you've probably heard of Varroa destructor. This is this parasitic mite that's really the scourge of the honeybee worldwide. And the reason it's so deadly is because it passes viruses like you see here. This deformed wing virus is really prevalent in honeybee colonies, and that's what makes Varroa such a problem. And because they're so hard to kill, because they've of resistance to different chemicals, and their biology is such that it's difficult to target them within a honeybee hive, even with non-chemical or especially with non-chemical treatments. And so most of my work has been looking for new chemicals that are effective at controlling Varroa, as well as I am generally interested in how different pesticides impact honeybee colonies, but because controlling honeybee pests is such a significant part of the beekeeping need right now in the world, it's kind of about integrating different approaches to control them. So that's kind of my research program in a nutshell. And I'm still building that out and writing as many grants as I can and to trying to get it going. All right, so let's jump into this so I don't take up too much time. But I wanted to start off with some definitions because I think this is going to help as we get into our discussion a little bit more. First of all, a pesticide is just a substance or a mixture of substances that is tasked at preventing, destroying, repelling, or mitigating any pest, right? And there's different kinds of pesticides, and pesticide is like the really broad term. But when we're talking about very specific targets, then we have, herbicides, fungicides, rodenticides. And of course, insecticides. And insecticides is far and away the most prevalent type of pesticide. Well, herbicides are up there, of course, but insecticides, I mean, really are the majority of the market of pesticide industry. Now, there are, just like anything, just like you might imagine, you know, when you have different kind of chemistries and different chemical structures, they're going to be broken down into certain classes. And there are dozens of insecticide groups, but there are a few that are the most common and most prevalent. So, you know, for years, organophosphates were the primary, were like the largest majority of insecticides, and they are still a big part of that. You know, what they do is they act on the insect nervous system by inhibiting an enzyme that would like stop the nervous system from firing. So basically, when you stop that enzyme from keeping the cell from firing the nerve, then basically you just have uncontrolled impulses, right? Now, the big problem with organophosphates is that they're really toxic to humans and birds and fish and basically all vertebrates. And so that's a really big problem from an environmental standpoint, right? Is organophosphates, they last a long time in the environment and they're very toxic to people and other vertebrates. Now, pyrethroids, whenever you see this word or like part of the word that is a roid, accidentally skipped. When you see the roid part of a word, that means that we are taking something, a basic chemical structure that is found in nature, and we're making it more toxic, right? So it's very similar to pyrethrins, which comes from, you know, some different groups of flowers, but these pyrethroids are a bit more toxic and bit more because they're synthetic chemicals. They tend to last longer in the environment. So these act a little bit different, but similarly on the insect nervous system, they're just causing rapid fires. They're somewhat toxic, but considerably less toxic than organophosphates. Now, nicotinoids, again, remember that noid means, or that oid part of the word means that, you know, nicotine has been used to control insects for thousands of years. But by making it an oid, that means we're creating something here. Now, you notice that this doesn't say neonicotinoids. That is kind of relatively new. Neo means new. And so those are the new nicotinoids, because nicotinoids have been around for decades. But so basically the way that these work, I mean, almost all insecticides work on the insect nervous system. Not all of them, but almost all of them work on the nervous system. Neonicotinoids or nicotinoids do the same, but just with a slightly different kind of mode of action. Now, the big benefit for nicotinoids versus some of these others is that they have a really low toxicity to vertebrates. So that means it's safer for humans to apply, and there's less impacts on like fish, birds, lizards, other organisms that might come into contact with this. So that's, you know, at the time, at least when this is developed, this is a big selling point, and it's very broad spectrum. So it kills a lot of insects. So it's a very effective insecticide. Okay. Now we're going to start talking a little bit more about toxicity. So just to break down a few terms, I mean, you know that toxic just basically means it's producing an adverse effect on an organism, right? And there's, of course, different levels of toxicities, and there's different types of toxicities. When we're in the research world, and when you're reading different papers, you're going to see these different types of toxicities. You'll see acute toxicities mentioned, which is, when you see the word acute, think very short term, right? So they're very a short term exposure that can be really deadly. So that's typically what we're after when we're trying to control a pest. You know, we're typically trying to kill them quickly, just acute toxicity to drop the pest, right? Now there's chronic toxicities where we might see, you know, after kind of a repeated long-term exposure, you know, what might happen. And sometimes, so this is often what we're looking at when we're thinking about non-target impacts, because oftentimes, you know, if we apply a chemical to the environment to try to control some crop pest, we're interested in killing the pest quickly, but we want to see what happens to lizards, birds, other non-target insects, and see, you know, what's happened to them if they're repeatedly exposed to something like this. Now, there's also residual toxicity, which, you know, if you spray a chemical and it's leaving behind a residue, then we're looking at how those traces and how long those traces can be toxic to different organisms. So those are kind of the three main types of toxicity. There are others, but those are the ones that you'll likely see and encounter in research papers. So let's talk a little bit about its impacts on bees. Now, when I'm talking about that, I already told you I'm kind of a honeybee person. That's just been my background as a beekeeper for years, and that's where I've focused my research. So I'm going to mainly talk about honeybees, but I'm also going to work in all the other bees kind of in general as well, because of course there's many more bees than just honeybees. But what we often see is that so when we do see acute exposures to and see those rapid deaths, you know, we usually see when flowers were sprayed while they were in bloom. So the bees are coming direct contact with high levels of the chemical. If I don't know if any of you remember in 2013 when there was that big bee kill in Oregon. I was actually doing my master's in Oregon at the time, and it was because a landscape company did not follow the label and was spraying for aphids in a parking lot and on these trees that were in full bloom, and there was just bees dead everywhere. So I mean, that was like a really big news story and caught a lot of attention and actually led to a lot of policy changes in the state of Oregon. But that's an example of an acute exposure where you just see massive bees dropping out of this. I mean, like a quick die off. So what you'll likely to see if I'm a beekeeper and I'm going into a colony and I see immediately like there's no foraging force, not a lot of bees out there, or I see bees that are at the front entrance and they're spinning, or you see a lot of disoriented shaking bees, a lot of bees fighting. You see this in other bee colonies, but most bees are not social, so you don't see some of those same cues. But with social insects and wasps, those are the kinds of or social bees and wasps, you'll likely see some of these signs for an acute toxicity. Now, for a true social insect like bumblebees and honeybees, you'll likely see impacts on queens, even though the queens might not be the ones that are going out there and becoming exposed. An acute exposure, you know, there might be just enough that these bees are dying relatively quickly, but they're bringing something back, and the queen is coming in contact with the pesticide. And you know, in the case of honeybees, we often see queens get banished when honeybees tend to blame everything on the queen, even if it has nothing to do with it. But if you see if you see a queen just walking around by herself, it's likely because the colony had been poisoned. I mean, it had an acute exposure. So that's kind of just one of the signs that you'll see for queens, but there are other reproductive issues, which I'll talk about in a minute. Now chronic exposure is usually more likely, especially when we're talking with honeybees, and I guess not just honeybees, bees in general. You're most likely going to see effects chronically. And that's because as long as people are following the label, you don't necessarily see those big die-offs. And so bees are going out, they're foraging, they're bringing things back into their colonies. And so what you'd likely see is poor brood development. You know, see how this is an example of like what we'd call a really spotty brood pattern, because there's lots of the queen's not laying in all the cells, or she did lay in all the cells, but those bees the developing larvae had problems, and so the workers are yanking them out. And so there's just this kind of shotgun pattern. You'll likely see, like, if there's a chronic exposure, you'll see the colony get weak. It'll get weak fast, but with an acute exposure, again, they're going to drop immediately. Chronic is like over maybe a few days to a week or two, you'll just see a rapid decrease in population. And there's much more, when you have a rapid decrease in population, you're likely going to have problems with overwintering in the honeybee world, since they overwinter together. Now, even probably more prevalent than acute exposure or chronic exposure is you'll get some sublethal effects. Now, sublethal effects are really quite difficult to disentangle from other problems, because there could be pathogens that cause these different effects, or there could be just other environmental stressors not related to pesticides in any way. So sublethal effects are really important, but they're difficult to study. But basically the idea, of sublethal means it's not quite lethal, right? But there are some effects to, like, behavior changes, maybe some physiological changes that just reduce their ability to thrive in some way, or maybe, for bees that rely so heavily on foraging and returning back to their home, they might become lost really easily, or there can be infertility, or for social, for really social bees like honeybees and bumblebees, you can have problems with communication amongst bees. So those are just some examples of sublethal effects. But oftentimes when we see sublethal effects, we see reproductive negative reproductive effects. So you see reduced sperm viability, or sperm production, or ovarial production in queens. Honeybees, they mate on the wing. So if you know a little bit about honeybee biology, the virgin queens will fly away from the nest, and then they will mate with drones that are in the area that will kind of run after the queen and chase her and try to mate with her. But when there is significant, or if there's like sublethal effects of maybe some chronic exposure, then the queens usually come back very poorly mated, because the drones either don't have, a healthy amount of sperm, or they're just not able to catch the queen or something. They're just not able to mate as well. So that can be kind of a longer colony level effect. Now, something to just make this all even more maybe confusing and difficult from the research perspective to even study is everything's a chemical. If you break it down into its most simple form, everything's chemicals. And so when you have different chemicals that are in the environment, as well as in the bee world, we're applying chemicals to control varroa, which I already mentioned, that scourge of the honeybee that we're trying to control. Beekeepers are using chemicals, and sometimes these chemicals can have synergistic or even just additive effects, which can cause pretty serious damage when in combination with one another. And then there are just a lot of growers, in order to just save time, I guess not just save time, but it's time is money and efficacy, and they will have these large tank mixes that they will mix multiple chemicals together to try maybe a fungicide, maybe an herbicide, maybe an insecticide all together. Maybe all three of those are individually might not be toxic to bees, but all together they can be quite toxic and have some sublethal effects. And what's more is you can often get synergisms where they are not just additive, but they really maybe one will prevent the insect from being able to metabolize a chemical, and it'll just make it incredibly more toxic, you know, so they can really play off one another. But again, this is an area of research that's really difficult because it's hard to disentangle these types of effects. Now, as I already mentioned, you know, I've primarily spent my career focusing on honeybees, but in large part, honeybees, because they are easy to manage, have fewer problems with pesticides. Even though they're often in agricultural systems, you know, if I'm a beekeeper, I can pick up my colonies and I can move them out of the area when they're going to spray, right? So I can get them out. With native bees, that's not usually the case, right? You can't just remove them from the system. And so they're often exposed to things at a higher level. And what's more is that, you know, honeybees have a buffer system because they have so many bees working together that even if there's an acute exposure and you lose the entire foraging force, that colony can still recover. What native bees are at greater risk, because if these bees die, then they don't reproduce, right? So you could have an entire generation of bees lost in an area just because of one bad spray, right? So some of these pesticide impacts are more pronounced or more devastating to native bees, more so than honeybees. Now, when I've kind of just mentioned to you kind of all these impacts to bees related to pesticides, but if I could make sure that you walk away with anything tonight, it's going to be on this slide. Okay, this is the most important thing that I want you to remember, is that risk is equal to toxicity times exposure. So an exposure is how likely, or the way that an insect is going to come into contact with that chemical. And we already talked about toxicity being, you know, what is going to impact that organism's health, right? But so risk is the probability that an insect is going to come into contact with this chemical. So to put it another way, it's easier for me to think about it in these terms. Let's say that, you know, we know that a lion is a hungry lion. A hungry adult lion is toxic to humans, right? We could say that, like, they will want to eat you. Okay. Now let's think about it this way though. So they are very toxic to humans, but our exposure to lions can be varied, right? If I am alone on the savannah at night, then my exposure to lions is pretty high. So my risk is really high. Okay. But if I'm at the zoo and there is a lion, but she's behind, you know, a glass or away from me in some kind of cage or pen, then my risk is significantly reduced, even though we're at a pretty close distance, right? Because my exposure to that lion is really low. So we have to think of pesticide impacts in terms of risk, not just toxicity and not just exposure. Okay. So let's really quick, I just want to mention a few routes of exposure. I know that you are all probably somewhat familiar with this, but honeybees, and not just honeybees, but most native bees can forage in a couple mile radius. Honeybees have a really large radius, so they can forage in a 5 mile radius. And if you pi r squared that and think of the whole area of that circle that bees could potentially be foraging on, we're talking about 78 square miles. So they can cover a lot of land. We can't necessarily always control what people are doing in all of these areas. So even though one group might be very careful about how they're spraying or applying pesticides, just a few miles away, those bees could still be exposed to that. So external exposure away from the hive is really common, and they can come into contact directly to the chemical, either through some kind of residual, or is often the case with neonicotinoids specifically is if you're in large agricultural systems, if they are applying treatments to, or like seeds that are already coated, then as you are applying these seeds, there's often this dust, like a wave of chemical that ends up kind of going out into the environment, and those can be pretty harmful as well to native bees. But again, it's the direct contact. Now, generally speaking here, neonicotinoids are not very toxic to insects, or at least to bees topically. So coming into contact, this direct contact is not particularly toxic. But when the insects are ingesting the chemical, that's when it becomes quite toxic. So honeybees or other bees, they're most likely to pick up these chemicals when they are foraging and actually collecting nectar. So some of these chemicals or pesticides can be systemic into the plant. Sometimes they're injected, sometimes they're, like I said, if the seed is coated with it, then as the plant develops, it's going to be developing more and more of that chemical within the plant. So it can even become part of the nectar or pollen that the bee is consuming. Sometimes, especially seedlings will have something called guttation, where they are basically letting the water is coming out of the leaves, and insects will go and collect that. So, and very often, especially with honeybees, but they need a lot of water to thermoregulate such a large hive. So when they're in systems or agricultural systems where there's maybe runoff with large spraying that gets into the water sources, the groundwater kind of nearby, or puddles of water nearby, then those bees can really bring that back and to their colonies, and can do a fair bit of damage. And so, and I kind of talked about the chronic effects of feeding young larvae and brood of kind of low levels or sublethal levels of pesticides can really do a lot of damage there. So I want to just spend the last few minutes just focusing specifically on neonics, because that's what this is an area, this is really hot topic when we're thinking of environmental protection. Now, there are many different kinds of neonicotinoid insecticides. I was just going to mention a few. Imidacloprid is the one that is kind of the poster child of all discussion related to neonics, and that's mainly because it's just been around the longest. It was first registered in the 90s, and so there's been lots of research that has been done on imidacloprid. Acetamiprid, imidacloprid is primarily used in like grains and cereals. Acetamiprid is also, similar to that, but it's more as different pests developed resistance to imidacloprid, then they started looking for new chemistries, and acetamiprid was one that kind of came in the 2000s. Clothianidin, thiamethoxam, these have been around for a while. Mainly, there's just, as I said, neonics are very broad spectrum, and so they kill a lot of pesticides. So if you're a grower, or they kill a lot of insect pests. So if you're a grower, this is great because it's going to control a lot of pests in one. Obviously the downside is that there are beneficial insects that will come into contact with some of these neonicotinoids. Now, how we go about actually testing whether a neonic is a problem, or what that level of toxicity is going to be done on various different levels. As I said, contact tests have been done extensively. That's part of the testing of getting any compound approved. But generally speaking, neonics are not incredibly toxic when they're just applied topically, at least the bees. And so, but larvae are very sensitive, even at really low amounts. So chronic infections can become a big issue if bees are bringing those back to the larva. Now, as I mentioned, sublethal effects is an important area of research, and one of the ways that we use to measure sublethal impacts of neonics on bees is through something called the proboscis extension reflex, PER. Maybe you've seen this before, seen videos. Basically, it's like kind of like Pavlov's dogs. I mean, it's training bees to recognize a certain smell. So you see here in this image of A, you would blow a certain smell over the bees' antennae, and then you would feed them immediately after, so they associate that smell with a food reward. And then if you could expose them to some kind of pesticide, then if you expose them, or if you blow that smell over their antennae, you should see them stick their proboscis out waiting for that food reward. Now, if there's sublethal effects, they might have a hard time remembering to do that. And so that's one way that we can measure sublethal impacts, but it is difficult, and not necessarily does that mean that there's going to be long-term impacts for an entire colony. And so there's still so many questions of what we really need to know. And I would say, as a researcher, as a beekeeper, I love bees, and I love honeybees specifically, and I like everything about it, and I want to protect my bees. But then as a researcher, and I read a lot of the studies, I have a lot of problems with some of the work that's been done, and mainly it's just that we see a lot of lethal and sublethal effects of neonicotinoids in the lab, but we don't necessarily see those same effects in the field when we're using realistic doses. So again, it comes back to the risk of exposure. I mean, if everything's toxic, it's all about the dose, right? Water can be very toxic to humans, but as long as it's at a certain dose, it's fine. So a lot of times in the research world, you see these published papers where they are exposing bees to doses that are really high, and then they're like, "Whoa, look, this is really toxic to bees," but not really. It's just that we're exposing them to really high levels. And another major issue that I think needs to be addressed in the world, or this area of research, is that so much of the work that's been done with neonicotinoids has been done through industry, because it's obviously, this is their business, is to produce chemicals that help growers. But all those data do exist, but they're not typically accessible. And so that's the work that I think really needs to be done, is kind of compiling a lot of this work and standardizing our risk assessments. Because, and I think that area has improved in the last decade or so, but if you go back into the before 2010, I mean, the risk assessments were really all over the place. So of course, there's been lots of discussion about neonics and their impacts. And there's been lots of movements of people pushing to ban. So in Europe and the EU, they were successful in, so they were successful at getting neonics banned. And first in 2013, the EU banned neonics for certain crops, and then in 2018 they banned them like outright for like even household use. Like nobody could use neonicotinoids in the EU. So I get asked a lot professionally, what do I think about that? Like, do I think we should push for that here in the United States? And my main feeling at this point is is I think that's a little rash right now for us. And I know there are plenty of people that disagree with me, and that's okay if you disagree with me. You know, my feelings towards this is that right now most of the research has shown that there are relatively few impacts when neonics are applied correctly. Now, that's not always the case, and people are fallible, and we make mistakes, and people are applying this irresponsibly, and we see non-target impacts that can cause a lot of problems. And I totally recognize that that is true. But I also feel that if we ban this outright, what are our options? You know, we don't necessarily have a lot of good options in a lot of the agricultural systems. And as I mentioned, the nice thing about neonics is that they are very safe for humans, okay, and for other vertebrates, but they're not safe at all for insects. And so that's a problem. But what do we do if we ban this? I mean, there are some alternatives for sure, but sometimes the alternatives, they're not any safer. They could cause other problems. And probably my biggest hang up of all is that at this point, we don't know very much about the impacts that the EU, I mean, I'm glad that the EU went first. Let's let they banned it. Let's see what happens. I feel like the research really needs to be done on what are the impacts now that they have banned it for this many years. I mean, we're almost on a decade now in some of these agricultural systems. What do we see a recovery? And I don't see a lot of that research yet. I think it's coming. It just hasn't been there yet. So that's one of my main questions. I just got, as my last slide, I just want to tell you a little bit about what I see as a need for some future work. One is doing some economic assessments of what are the impacts of banning and what are the options, right? Part of my focus has been screening for new compounds, primarily for looking for different chemistries that will control the honeybee mite, but I think it's going to be important to look for safer alternatives, and that's some work that needs to continually be done, as well as collecting long-term impact and measuring how potential synergistic effects of different tank mixes. There's a lot of people working on that. And so I think we will hopefully get to some progress. I can show you just really quick on the screen. I've showed you some of the work that I've been doing the last few years, and we're about to publish some of this work hopefully in the next few months. But one of the things that I've been working on has been trying to improve the EPA testing for pesticide impacts on honeybees, and trying to make it a little bit more field realistic by including different matrices, because up to this point, it's only been really for oral exposure. It's just been feeding bees through sugar syrup a certain dose, right? So we can do that easily in a cage experiment, but we've come up with some ways to feed them through pollen, as well as mix chemicals into wax. And then what we can do is we can create these kind of worst case scenario situations where we have these doses that might show up in the environment, and see, you know, what that does to mortality and sublethal effects. And here's just one example of what we did with the imidacloprid. Up here, these blue lines, these are our controls. So you can see that they essentially survived this whole 10-day period. And then you've got, we've got this red line, this kind of purplish line and this gold line here, these were our controls. They go down, they sharply decline because these were the bees that had a toxic substance that was meant to kill them, just to show that, yes, when we mix a chemical into the pollen, it does kill them. Yes, when we mix it into the wax, it does kill them. So that's what these lines are showing you. So our controls, all of our controls work. Now this black line here, this is what happened when we found an article that was published a few years ago, that where these authors were collecting pesticide, or they were collecting wax, pollen, nectar from honeybee colonies that were in agricultural systems, and they were saying this is the highest amount ever recorded in wax, nectar, and pollen. And so we took those same doses and put those in and exposed them directly to honeybees, and we did see significant mortality. We saw about 50% mortality. So at the very worst, even when they were exposed to everything at the highest levels, there was mortality, but it's about 50%. So not over 10 days. And so it's not going to drop those bees really quick. But this was just kind of like a proof of concept kind of experiment where we could show, hey, this type of testing is useful in having realistic types of exposures. And so that's some of the work that I plan on doing a bit more of with different compounds, and also doing similar work with honeybee larvae. So, all right, I will stop talking for a minute, and we can, I want to hear from you and try to answer some questions. I apologize, it went a little bit longer than I intended, but hopefully I have a few minutes for some questions. So David, I see.
Yeah, I'll start it off. By the way, for anyone else who has questions in the reaction section at the bottom of your screen, you can click on that and you'll find a raised hand in there and do that for the raising hand. It makes it a lot easier for Dr. Jack to know who to call on next. I have a bunch of questions. I'll ask until someone else is, I guess Dean's got some too. I'll ask several of them then, and perhaps I can get back to me later. First of all, I'm wondering about what is the risk of neonics to both the wild and versus wild and the non-kept bees versus the kept bees? If it's I mean, certainly they're going to get a lot more of different toxins being in the wild than kept bees are, because you can move them out of danger areas faster. But I'm just curious overall, what's
Yeah, and that's a great question, David. And so, I mean, just like everything, this is totally a scientist answer. It depends, right? If you think of some bees, they have very specific phenologies where they're only going to emerge out at certain times of years. At a certain time of the year, they might only be here for 3 months, and then they're overwintering, or their emergence is kind of depending on the flowers that might be emerging in that area. And so even if something is applied in February, but that bee does not come out until April, then their risk is really low, right? Because they're not overlapping with that. But at the same time, they can also have a high risk if they are in the area when it's being sprayed, and depending on the chemical, if it is one that has a long half-life that doesn't break down readily in the environment, then they could be in a situation where there's continue applications and continue exposure because they're not removed from there. And if the chemical doesn't break down, then they're going to constantly be exposed to that. So it all depends. They can be at higher risk because they are not getting removed from the situation, but for some instances, they could be relatively low risk because they're not there. So a good example of that is almond pollination. In almond groves in California, almonds grow they bloom in February, and the only bees that are really present at that time are honeybees, because beekeepers are shipping their bees for those pollination contracts. But the reason they have to do that is because there's not wild bees at that time of the year in California. So the exposure to honeybees is really high. The exposure to native bees is really low. So it all depends. Yeah.
And also, I want to know, what is where does glyphosate fit into the risk, curve for honeybees as well?
Yeah, good question. So glyphosate is an herbicide that is very common in agriculture, and there is some inherent risk, even because it is even though it is an herbicide and not directly toxic necessarily, like you're likely not going to see any acute toxicity, but what you will see is some sublethal effects, because glyphosate has been shown to really clean out the guts of bees and really affect the gut microbiome, so killing the bacteria of bees' guts. Now, that in itself is not necessarily going to wipe out all these bees, but then when you add additional stressors, then it could be a big problem. So as I mentioned with tank mixes.
Cameron, if I can stop you just for a second. I've read some research that says that there is a neurotoxic element to glyphosate, in experiments where they put, various concentrations of glyphosate, in liquid, with sugar, near where the honeybees were at. And, the test resulted in, much longer time for the bees to return to the hive and things like that. So I would think that would be a big problem, and also in their communication as well.
It could. I haven't heard that, David, but as I said before, the dose makes the poison, right? It's all about the dose. And probably at really high concentrations, you probably start to see some more significant.
Are these toxic? Are neonicotinoids and glyphosate? Do they build up in the body of the bee, or do they get washed out pretty fast?
Yeah, good question. So I don't know the answer necessarily for glyphosate. I'm not as familiar with that, with those chemistry. Most neonicotinoids, they can, but most bees don't live long enough for it to, just because it's building up in there doesn't necessarily mean it's a huge problem. I mean, most bees don't, in the summer, honeybees are living for 6 weeks, right? So even if they're building some up, that's not usually the problem. But as I said, there can be those chronic effects, so it can affect them, but it doesn't usually build up to really high levels.
Mm.
Yeah. Okay, and one last question.
Okay, go ahead, Dave.
Is what is your experience with the effects of neonicotinoids on wild bees, on in the non-commercial use bees?
Yeah, so this is, I have not personally done research with a lot of wild native bees, but there. I'm trying to think of some good resources for you. So here at the University of Florida, if one name that you might want to look up is Rachel Mallinger. So she is a wild bee expert in our department, and she might be able to give you some more information. But kind of going back to my earlier point, David, is it all just kind of depends. It depends on the risk depends on their exposure and the toxicity. There are some of these chemicals that are not overly toxic, but most neonics are toxic to insects, because that's what they are for, is killing insects. And so, but they might not be as exposed to them depending on their phenology. So the risk is all dependent on those toxicity and exposure. So
let me close out my time here with just making a comment. And I think that's I think we need to pay a lot more to the idea of the protective principle than we are doing. And I think the idea of perhaps limiting our usage of these a little bit more, because just because they're not going to affect bees that we keep doesn't mean that we should throw away the entire insect world, in areas where we don't have, those bees. And that's a big deal. And so I mean, from that standpoint, it is still a big concern to me. Thank you very, very much for coming tonight. I really appreciate it. I've been wanting to hear more, views about this, and I learned an awful lot just from listening tonight. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David.
Yeah.
Bettina, do you have some questions?
Oh, well, I'm like David. I never stop. So I would like to just comment very briefly. To me, the danger of glyphosate is that it's a broad spectrum herbicide. So it wipes out food sources for the bees. To me, that's the biggest danger, by the way, because, if all the so-called weeds are gone, the bees and other insects don't have pollen sources anymore and nectar sources. But so I wanted to know about neonicotinoids. You use them to coat seeds, right? And then they get systemic in plants, and then if insects forage on the plants, they get killed. That's the idea.
Yes, but generally speaking, it's for those insects that are feeding on the plant, right? I mean, and not feeding on the plant products. So
okay, so they munch on the leaves.
So if they're munching on the leaves, then they're going to get exposed. Yeah. If they're tapping into the phloem, then they're going to get exposed. Now, those chemicals can show up in the nectar and the pollen, but it's usually at a lower level than what is going to be like in the plant tissues themselves, if that makes sense. But okay,
so it is. Then it does seem to be more toxic to those insects that really munch on the plants rather than the bees that collect nectar and pollen. I guess that's that is true. But again, they're still picking it up, and now they're bringing it to their colony. So there's still some effects, but it's not that with the bees or with the insects like a caterpillar that's munching on the leaves. You're going to get an acute effect, something that's going to kill them rapidly. You're not going to see that. Even if it's systemic and it's at a really high level, you're probably not going to see that for a bee collecting nectar and pollen. Yes. And then you also have other neonicotinoids that are applied differently or only coating for seeds? No, you can have, in fact, I'd probably say most of them are foliar sprays. So you're spraying on stuff. Yeah. Okay. Well, I guess that goes a little bit too far, but still, I do want to throw out this observation because I was working on neonicotinoids at the department, and I did foliar sprays. Those were novel products where they threw together two insecticides, like Cameron was talking about, and one of those compounds was extremely toxic to adult honeybees. I mean, it really, in my opinion, it was scary. It killed, so we tested for up to 4 weeks. We sprayed the leaves, and then we exposed bees to the sprayed leaves for up to 4 weeks. And after 4 weeks, this one compound still killed 95% of the bees that got exposed to it, just by, sitting on the leaves. So I thought that was a bit scary. But anyway, so I also would like to know about the environmental fate of the neonicotinoids. Do they accumulate in the environment, or do they degrade quickly? Yeah, good question. So compared to some other pesticides, they do degrade relatively quickly, but I mean, not quick enough, because the idea is that you do want a pesticide that is going to degrade quickly, because you want it to have a quick flash treatment, kill the pests, but then degrade quick enough that other insects that are coming to that area are not going to pick it up. So it's a little bit different. The degradation time is a little bit different for each of the compounds. But I'm not on the top of my head. I'm not quite sure how fast is rapidly. I'm thinking, I mean, it's usually within a couple weeks, but that's relatively fast compared to some others, but that's still plenty of time for other non-target organisms to come into contact. Yes. Okay. Yeah. And then also just one final comment, in your opinion, I guess also operator error is a big problem, right? That operators don't follow label instructions and that get carried away by mixing all different kinds of pesticides and applying them.
Yes,
Okay.
definitely. That's often when we see a problem, is when
Mhm.
there's some operator error. Like I said, most of the time when under labeled rates, we don't see really toxic effects. But when people are applying things carelessly, that's when we see a big bee die off. And that's when often we have a knee-jerk reaction, like we got to get rid of everything, like blah, blah, which I'm not necessarily advocating for getting rid of everything, but that's what
Mhm.
we see the biggest problems is when they're applied incorrectly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks,
Mhm.
Scott.
Yeah,
Did you have a
thank
question?
you.
Yeah, I just had and you may have covered this. I heard you talk a little bit about what Europe has done. And I mean, this is, I think, maybe a place where I side with David a little bit in the precautionary principle. Can you speak more to why they made that step? I mean, realizing that I'm sure it had large impacts on agriculture in Europe. I mean, you're saying that they're coming up on 10 years worth of data for that, but I mean, they obviously made that decision without having all of that. Can you speak any more to if you know anything about why that decision was made there?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's because the, you know, we as the US, I mean, we are such a big agricultural country, right? I mean, this is a huge part of what we do. And I think we would have so much pushback to change something like to make such a sweeping change. UK didn't necessarily feel that way. So it started kind of in the UK and then it went to the EU and then they kind of made some choices at an EU level. Now, I think they were just a bit more progressive in doing this and having that reaction to just get rid of it because they could see that, yes, there are lots of problems associated with that. I do know from a lot of some conferences and things from that I've attended where it's actually politically quite contentious subject in Europe as well. Because it has put the ag industry in kind of a tough straits because neonics make up a huge portion of the chemical industry and of what they have to control pests. So I don't know necessarily all the reasons that they went through, but I think they just had a lot of support and a lot of pressure on the leaders to make that change. But to my point that I mentioned before is I'm curious to see those data. I really want to know, like, did it have an impact? And so far, nobody has even that I really did. I've tried to look for this to see who's publishing data on what has happened since this ban, and I haven't seen anything come out yet. So I'm hoping to see it in the future. And then if we see good results, then maybe that's something that, I mean, I'll jump on board too, but at that point, I'm not there yet at this point.
No, I mean, I appreciate it. I guess I usually what happens, you know, something like that's banned is there's kind of a race to the next magic bullet. And very often the next magic bullet is worse than the last magic bullet. Yeah. Although we don't know that for a long time.
Yeah. Yeah. The damage is already done, I guess.
I really appreciate the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. George, I'm sorry if I'm going way over on time too. I mean, Nisha or you guys can pull me and yank me out.
No, you're fine. Go ahead,
Okay.
George.
I'll try to be quick. So it appears that at least two of the pesticides.
I'm George, but that's okay.
Oh, okay. I'm George too. Okay, I didn't.
Go ahead, George.
Okay, and I'll be quick. It appears as though at least two of them focus on acetylcholine or neurosynaptic transmission. So the organophosphates focus on acetylcholine esterase, the enzyme, and the nicotinoids competitively bind as a mimic to tie up acetylcholine esterase?
So they
Is
don't,
that-
so the nicotinoids don't bind to the esterase. The esterase is going, I mean, that, so organophosphates, they're acetylcholine esterase inhibitors. So they're taking the end, so you have acetylcholine that I'm gonna put my hands right here. So it
Yeah.
opens up the channel. So now you have, so the acetylcholine opens up the channel. So now you have, you know, the sodium flooding that channel, and causing that action potential. And then the acetylcholine esterase comes in and removes acetylcholine. And so now that channel is closed, and that's the proper function. So with organophosphates, you're targeting the acetylcholine esterase, so that enzyme that would release it no longer works. And so now the channels are held open.
So there's more of a global complete, that's why it's so much more dangerous than the neonic.
Well,
than the
those
nicotinoids.
are more dangerous because they don't break down well, and they are very toxic to our acetylcholine. Okay, so they will. So if humans or vertebrates get it, it'll do the exact same thing to us very readily. Now, what's different with neonics or with nicotinoids, they, instead of doing anything to the enzyme, they compete with the acetylcholine, and they will go into those acetylcholine receptors, bind to it, and just hold it open.
So it's a
Acetylcholine
competitive binder.
esterase, yeah, acetylcholine esterase can't break that down because it's not the same. It's not the same thing.
Yeah.
And so it just holds those channels open. So it's doing the similar function. It's just doing it differently. But our acetylcholine receptors in our body do not bind well to, or the neonicotine, they don't bind to our receptors as well. That's why it's so low toxicity for mammals and for other vertebrates.
You're talking
But
about the
it's very-
neonicotinoids?
Yep. That's why we have a low toxicity to us.
But it's still addressing the synaptic transmission, is that?
Yep.
Okay.
Same function.
So is it likely that they could ever create a pesticide that targets everything or mostly other things and less bees? Is that, I mean, can you get that specific?
Perhaps, you know, the future in that is RNAi technology. Have you all heard of that before? So RNAi is RNA, the I stands for interference. So you're taking a piece of genetic code for your target organism, and you would be targeting a specific segment of that genetic code that is specific to that organism. Maybe it disrupts their reproductive function, maybe it reproduces or affects their respiration, but whatever it is, it's very specific to that organism.
Cool.
And so that is, I think, the future, but RNAi has proved very difficult. It has worked in some systems, but it's very difficult usually to deliver something like RNA because it breaks down really quick, and especially in the environment. Whereas a lot of these other chemical structures, I mean, they're pretty hardy. You could spray them on, and even sitting in full sunlight, you know, with all the radiation from the sun, they're going to be fine. RNAi doesn't work. It's so soft, and it gets metabolized, and so that creates a whole different issue. But I think that is what you're talking about. That's where we can get really specific and target very specific organisms.
Thank you.
All right, George Hockmuth.
Yeah, Cameron, thanks for the presentation. Sorry I missed the first few minutes of it. You might have even answered this question, but you mentioned operator error several times, and there was a question about it. So could you review with us what kind of training and what kind of licensing pesticide applicators must have? You know, maybe just focus on Florida.
Yeah, that's important because it is different depending on the states. The states will have their own rules and regulations. So there is some training for certain pesticides. Some pesticides, as you know, I mean, in fact, a whole lot of them, you don't need any kind of training because we could just go to Home Depot and just buy it ourselves, right?
Right.
And some of them are actually fairly toxic. Most of them are not toxic to humans, which is why you could go buy them, but they could still have really rough environmental impacts, which is unfortunate. There should be probably more trainings. So depending on the chemical, and with Neonics specifically, I don't think there's specific training for the household types of chemicals, but the ones that are intended to apply to maybe large scale agricultural systems or landscape, or like for ornamentals and things, and then landscapes, they're supposed to go through some trainings and be registered to do that, but I don't know all the details of the registration process. And they're supposed, but I do know you do need to get some kind of registration, and you have to have CEUs, those continuing education units. Every couple of years or so, they're supposed to come back for some kind of retraining. I don't know all the details related to that, but I think it all kind of depends on the scale that you're applying at.
Yeah, it just seems to me that some of the concerns raised by the folks tonight, a better understanding of what the legal world is out there. I know that I used to have, when I worked for IFAS, I had a pesticide applicator's license, and that was mostly for certain classes of chemicals, and you had to have so many CEUs every year. And IFAS Extension always, when they made programs and gave presentations on pest management or disease management, which is very common in Extension across the state, they usually tried to set up those presentations, those meetings, to include presentations that would allow growers to get their CEUs.
Yep.
So I guess I've been out of it now for 6 years, and I guess I was curious when the issue of operator error came up, what is going on out there in the training and the licensing world for these chemicals. I mean, I hope it's not going backwards, because who are we putting on these tractors with the sprayers and the mixed load sites?
Who's mixing it?
Who is in charge? Is the person driving the tractor putting the sprays on? I don't think that in many cases they're the ones that have to get the training. I think it's the people that are mixing and loading and supervising that person on the tractor. So
yeah, I think you're right.
And there should be no reason why we're out killing bees with pesticides.
We've looked into that a couple times, George, just for wetland stuff, and it is a licensed applicator, and I think there just has to be one on a crew. So I think you're exactly right. It'd probably be the person like mixing up the chemicals, but the applicator may or may not then also have that licensing.
Yeah. That's the way I understand it, Scott. Anyway, I just wanted to raise that question. I think it's something for all of us to be aware of. I know that, what is it, the FIFRA Act that requires the pesticide training as part of that. So I'm assuming all of that is still in force as I remember it when I was working. Anyway, thanks a lot for the information. It was good.
Good, thank you. I appreciate that, and yeah, thanks for bringing that up. I mean, that is, I think, probably our best bet at reducing operator error is making sure that there are appropriate trainings, and probably more so than, in my opinion, than banning pesticides would be more regulations in terms of how they're used and requiring more training.
Yeah.
But yeah. Thanks. Good point.
Agree.
Bruce.
Yes. I was interested in you talking about the EU and the work there. It seems to me that there should have been some studies done to show if it has affected crop yield, or whether it has affected the way the farming is done, if some of the farming is now done on a more rotational basis, or if monocrops are not as prevalent in order to get something in there that will be a natural pesticide or something.
Yeah,
Th-
I agree. I'm waiting for those data to see those points, because certainly people have to be looking at that at this point.
Yeah.
And so if anybody here tonight finds something that you want to send to me, my email's on the screen right now. Go ahead and reach out to me, because I'd love to read it. I'd love to know. But I agree with you, Bruce. I think that certainly people have to be looking at this. I mean, it's such a big policy change. And it definitely affected, I mean, it took away probably the number one tool that growers had. And so seeing the economic impacts of that, or how they've had to deal with that, I'm sure there's some information there, but I'm a little bit out of that realm.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Jack, for speaking tonight. And thank you everyone for your questions. I know I learned a lot, and I think everyone here shares that sentiment. So once again, thank you.
Thank you very much for having me. And if you have any other questions, feel free to send me an email. I'm happy to
Perfect.
help if I can. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Cameron.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. And thanks, Bettina, for setting that up. So why don't we jump right into, is Gus still here? Yes. Hi, Gus.
Hi, everybody.
Hi.
So what I got here tonight, it's actually pretty short. Can I get my screen, share the screen? Yes. Where are these things? Okay, so this is something the committee looked at back in December of 2019, January of 2020. And it came, the original one came from Zero Waste Gainesville. They were trying to get the county and the city of Gainesville to do what they call a zero waste purchasing policy. So I believe you guys got a presentation from Amanda from Zero Waste Gainesville back in December, looked at their ideas, and that's this document that's on the screen right now. And based on the presentations, my understanding is she made some changes, and then EPAC submitted the recommendations to the county commissioners back in January. So at that point, the original proposal by Zero Waste Gainesville and EPAC recommendations were presented to the Climate and Water Committee. And then both of them referred this item to the appropriate city and county commissioners, and then COVID hit and the whole thing just kind of sat there for a year. So as part of the implementation of the zero waste plan, we're just kind of bringing this again. So we took the original documents. I had meetings with county procurement, county environmental protection, excuse me, and with Zero Waste Gainesville, and we came up with a modified proposal, which is what I got here. How do I get to this? Here we go. So this is what we came up after meeting with procurement, EPD, and Zero Waste Gainesville. And my plan is to take this and present it to the board probably at the next the second meeting in January. Same time, we're going to be talking to them about the environmental industrial park screening criteria. So I know that you guys are doing workshop mode, so I can't get a letter like you guys provided before. But I'll be happy to listen if you have any questions, have any comments, any ideas to make this thing better, or if you're happy with the way it is right now.
Yeah, I'll be honest. I haven't had a chance to really look at this in any detail, Gus. I don't know if anybody else has more specific suggestions or thoughts.
And that is fine. Like I said, I'm not gonna take this to the board until next year. So if you guys just want to individually take a look at it, you can see how it started, where it is right now and just email me your specific personal comments, that'd be fine as well.
Okay.
Gus,
Yes.
have you run this back by Amanda, and do you have comments from her on this?
Yeah, this is after discussions with Amanda, so she's in agreement with this.
She signed off on this. Okay,
Yes.
excellent.
Can I ask a question, and I think I have brought up kind of this same thing the last time this was discussed. Is there, I realize that everyone likes their catchy slogans, but obviously zero waste is not possible. Has there been any consideration of actually putting a title on this? I mean, I feel like this is a little bit, the perfect being the enemy of the good. Has there been, I mean, is there a way to come up with something better than zero waste procurement policy? Because, I mean, frankly, I feel like then we're just doing kind of lip service, and
I understand what you're
obviously
saying.
not
But,
possible.
I understand what you're saying, but yeah, to answer the question, no, I'm not aware of any proposals to change away from calling things zero waste, fill in the blanks. That seems to be the catchphrase, like you said.
Gus, isn't most of this already something that the county does for purchasing? I know EPD does it, doesn't it? And didn't we have that discussion a while back?
So EPD, they have kind of like a picnic type of stuff where a variety of washable utensils that they use for their functions, and that works for EPD. But most of the other departments don't have something like that, and in a lot of cases that just wouldn't work. So that's why if you look at the original document and this one, you will see a lot of moving from banning to minimizing, because we recognize that in some situations you will maybe need to use something besides a washable dish. So we kind of built in some leeway into the policy.
So
You're making the attempt to define, minimize.
Excuse me?
I'm sorry, I don't want to interrupt Scott. Scott had the floor.
So I mean, one other thing I guess I would just voice here is that this has come up with plastic bags. It has kind of come up time and time again with different things. But I would imagine that this is also advocating in favor of stuff that is in theory compostable and potentially recyclable and stuff like that. And very often the environmental impact of those things currently is substantially higher than the non-renewable alternatives. And I'm just voicing my opinion, but I don't think, once again, we're greenwashing with this. And so I would advocate against having those kind of requirements in here. Like paper straws, first off, they're awful. No one on this call likes paper straws, I can guarantee, because no one likes paper straws. And that is probably considered a better thing to purchase than plastic straws based on this, despite the fact people will go through 2 or 3 of them and the environmental impact of paper straws is substantially higher than plastic straws.
I've seen some pretty good paper straws, Scott, but I admit in general people hate them. The cheap ones that don't hold up, past the first sip. Yeah, definitely, those are useless. But I don't use straws anyway.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's obviously the best way to go. But the expensive ones are obviously also having a larger environmental impact. So there is a nasty trade-off here.
I'd love to see a breakdown, by what if we have what is the perfect cup to use? What is the perfect straw to use? What is the perfect alternative silverware to use? I'd love to see some things.
I'll give you my 2 cents, and don't use straws. Period.
Yeah,
I don't disagree, but I mean, it's somewhat the same thing with cups. It's somewhat the same thing with any little bags that you provide handouts with. It's it's the fact that we don't have a great sustainable goods marketplace yet, and economies of scale don't function well for what are still niche products. And so we claim that we are having a smaller environmental impact by using things that are in theory compostable, except for there is no commercial composting in Gainesville, which means they go to a landfill just like the plastic does. Except for in the landfill, they break down and to some extent provide methane, which is, you know, more of a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. So that's fine. I just wanted to make the statement I normally make, and that's all. The only comment I wanted to voice is, once again, it's not based on feelings. It should be based on science. And these policies are usually more feelings-based than science-based.
Would it be absurd? I don't know, this may be crazy. Would it be absurd to have a sterilizer or a small dishwasher that you can just put all the stuff that's been used for a public meeting into it? Stainless steel straws, whatever the hell it is, it can be clean. I guess that's how, I mean, I use the same stainless straw will last 10,000 years from as far as I'm concerned, you know?
Don't use straws. Solution agreed upon, George, already.
What's that?
Don't use straws is already the agreed upon.
Yeah, okay, well, forget straws. There are other means. I mean, why couldn't we have a sterilizer there to just throw the plates and everything in there and clean it and be done with it?
I mean, it does say use washable plates, cups, and silverware when possible. So presumably there's a thought that there's a way to kind of wash all those things.
So there are places where there's a kitchen available in some departments. There are places where there's not. So that's why we wanted to put that option in there.
I see.
Hey, Gus, raised hand doesn't work, so I took my hand down.
Right.
Hey, Gus, you know, listen to some of the other comments here. Is there a possibility that this kind of a protocol could be tried on some agency or some group in the county that, you know, would be carefully chosen, and try this out and just see what kinds of unintended consequences there may be before it's opened up for countywide for everybody? Because, you know, going back to Scott's concerns, I guess mine would go even further than that there probably are groups and offices that could not do this. I mean, they don't have the wherewithal to have a dishwashing machine or you know, the kinds of resources that would allow them to safely and properly implement this protocol. So I guess maybe I'm wondering if there's been some thoughts about field testing this, so to speak.
So George, to answer your questions, yeah, I guess it's been field tested. EPD's been doing it for years. I mean, it's not a new thing for, I guess you see, them. So it's already been in place at EPD. And I do agree with you. There are locations that there are no facilities to wash any of this stuff or to do what we would like to aspire to. And that's why we changed the banning of things to minimize the use of things, just to take that into consideration.
Gus? Yeah, I mean, and I like that about this. I think that's, you know, that's the only way you're going to get something like this put into use. I'm hoping that there's some sort of an educational factor that I'm not seeing, you know, in these few lines that are showing at the top here. It's half pages all I have on my screen. That would say, okay, when you go to use something, first think, do we have something available? If they got 4 people in there, do we have 4 washable plates, 4 washable cups, 4 washable, sets of silverware that we can use for those people? Whereas if it's 50 people, then okay, maybe you do have to go to some other means.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't been to every single department, and it kind of varies. I mean, some people been doing this for years. They bring their own utensils and their own plates if there's a kitchen available. I know that within solid waste, for a number of years, we've been offering compostable paper plates and cups and stuff like that for county events. The one thing we're adding here, and this was a suggestion from Amanda, is to make sure that whatever compostable item we're using is PFAS free. So that's something new for us. So, I mean, there is nothing here that's totally new for the county. It may be totally new for the whole county as a group. But
Which,
this,
which leads me to the question: when are you guys, since you're in charge of that part of the county, when are we going to have a new composter, with a commercial size composter put in there that we can send our composting stuff to?
so the county is not planning to build one, but the private sector is. Life Soils, I think you guys are familiar with that company. They are in negotiations with the city of Newberry, and that's where let's call it the large scale composting operation for the county is going to take place.
What's the name of it again?
Life Soils,
How do you spell it?
Life Soils.
Oh, okay, Lysol. Oh, them. Okay, yeah.
Yeah, I thought I had given you guys a presentation at some point, but maybe not. But yeah, they are the ones who are kind of spearheading the large composting operation for the county.
Oh, awesome. Yeah, other than that, I like, that this deals with, the problem in a realistic way, and says minimize, is the first line of everything where you can, so.
There will, if anybody else has any other thoughts or ideas between now and next year, just shoot me an email.
Yep, sure will. Thank you.
Thank you, Gus.
Thank you.
Okay. Let me get back to our agenda. So, so it looks like the next item, and David, I know you also wanted to discuss the CCAC's report or whatever it was. I'm still fishing for it in my inbox. But before we do that, there's a discussion on election of officers. I'm not sure what that's referring to, but Mark, is that, would you enlighten us?
If the officers stay the same as they are now, I talked to Steve about this today, then there's no reason to meet. You could just approve the selection, whether it's this meeting or next month, what just do. If somebody wants to run for an office, then we have to have a quorum, physical quorum. And the CCAC has done this recently where they just met for like 10 minutes, in one of the building facilities to discuss it. I mean, they discussed it in advance and then they just kind of, voted. They had enough people for a quorum. So it's kind of up to the committee whether or not, again, the three officers, if you wanted to stay the same, then, you could approve that. If somebody else wanted to put their name in the hat, then we just have to make arrangements to have enough people for a quorum, whether it's next month or in February. There's no rush on that.
Okay, so it's three officers that are up for election, or three positions that are up for election.
Yeah, you, David, and Bettina.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the question is are we willing to stay in the position we're in? And I certainly am.
Right.
Although I'm also willing to give it up to anyone who really wants to a chance of doing it as well. So.
Sure. Yeah, I agree with you, David. I'm, willing to stay in this position. And if there is somebody who would like to, take over, that's, that's fine as well. And then on that, Mark, if, is there kind of a, like, you either do it, by this date, or, you have to kind of wait until the next cycle, or can we kind of ad hoc decide when we want to elect officers in this like workshop format?
That's a good question. I think because in the workshop format, it's informal. I mean, there's no official recording or anything, and there's nothing to approve by the the BOCC, it's up to you. I'm talking to Steve whether you'll do it now or January, February. It is not critical. It just kind of needs to be, within the same time frame of, I didn't realize until discussing it. I guess it was last December when y'all approved the officers that you have in place now. As long as it's within that kind of the same time frame, that's fine.
Okay.
Yeah, point of order on this is simple, is that technically, as of this month, offices expire, since we are to re-elect every year. But at the same time, there is a provision that, when an office has expired until it has been filled by the next person, they remain in office, so that we can just not act on it and therefore stay in office in the position we're in. It's that simple.
And that's a good point, David, because all three of you were just re-approved this past June by the board. So y'all are good for another, couple of years. So you're already in place.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think maybe one thing that we can do, if somebody or multiple people are interested in getting a position, an officer position, they can maybe just reach out to you, Mark, or let us all know here. And
Either way, it's fine. If somebody wants to discuss it, separate from the committee, but at least bring it to my attention, then that's fine. But it's up to y'all as a committee, what your preference.
Yeah, and I guess I'll just put out there, sort of, like what David said, if somebody wants to take over the role, that's fine. And I'm also, willing to meet to have a quorum in order to elect new officers if somebody wants to jump in and run for office.
Yeah, and I just want to say I didn't see the agenda at all, but generally speaking, I think, it's a good idea to give everybody the opportunity to hold an office. So I appreciate that this is on the agenda and that we are talking about it. But like the other two said, I'm also happy to continue as a secretary. However, I think others also need opportunities.
That's my that what we should do is just simply plan on it. Obviously, we can't vote on it, but we should plan on the very first time we do get back together in person. We can then say one of our first orders of business will be to formally elect new officers.
I like that.
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay. And I guess now we can jump in with the last 20 minutes or so. David, why don't you introduce us to the CCAC piece that you had sent via Mark?
Yeah, this came out of the last meeting that CCAC had just about a month ago now, and maybe less actually. And I thought it was an excellent source of items, and they prioritize these different. I think they're in alphabetical order, so don't take if you have that list. Can we put it up on the screen? Mark?
Do you have it, Nisha, readily up? I'll have to dig in. I sent it back about 5 o'clock, maybe. It's a spreadsheet.
It's like an Excel sheet.
I might be able to do it. If you can give me permission to share, I'll set it. I'll put it on there.
Yeah, you got it, Dave.
Okay, so I'm looking for the right. Oh, there we go. Share screen. Okay, good. And then let's put this is it here. Share. Okay. So I've got to minimize my little window there. So, okay. So can everybody see this? Is it taking up the right amount of the screen and all?
Yeah.
Well, that was good.
I can tell you right off the bat, if you scroll, if I go down the bottom, I'm going to scroll down the bottom, and this bottom one here, where CIKR, disaster and risk reduction, that was pretty much accepted as being the number one importance there. And then it went back up to the top to between, I think, agricultural compatibility and food security and natural ecosystem shifts. But basically, these are just the different, a breakdown of different areas in which I think that they, saw problems coming with climate change. And I thought this might be a good resource, and it actually doesn't take a lot of time unless someone has some questions on it, as to how it's laid out. I think it just was a very, very well done, and they spent quite some time. This was enhanced by their meeting, so it went a little further. But it, went through each section and added all the different things that they felt were critical for that section. I guess every effect that, concern or adverse effect, it says on the right. So that explains, I think, how this, spreadsheet was put together.
Hey, David, what is CCAC?
Hold on again. I've got to bring it back up again. CCAC. CCAC.
Citizens Climate Advisory Committee.
Yes. Okay.
Oh, Citizen Climate. Okay, thank you.
Okay.
I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, Melissa or Trista, are either one of you on that committee?
I believe Trista had mentioned that perhaps in our first meeting when we joined EPAC. I'm not sure if it was this or something else though, so I'll let her speak to it.
And what the plan is kind of David was indicating, is the county has hired a consulting firm, Jones Edmonds, to do a vulnerability assessment that will utilize this as kind of the foundation or the baseline information to do an evaluation of ranking those top priority project areas that present, the greatest risk or potential risk. There's ways of actually a risk assessment to determine how they're going to rank those. So that's kind of I think that assessment will take a year. I don't know, they haven't signed the contract yet, but that will help to determine in terms of prioritizing capital improvement projects for, future board approval.
And for our use, I thought it was an excellent resource. Okay, so that's why I'm bringing it to the group, so that we have this resource as we progress with our climate change community conversations in the future.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, thank you, David. I'm just kind of searching through it now. So this third-party company that's coming in to do the assessment, they didn't actually come up with this list, right? This list was
no, that's my knowledge. This was come up by CCAC themselves.
Gotcha.
Right.
And primarily the chair. She had it all put together, and then everyone else kind of added to it. But they have been working on this in previous meetings as well. They just kind of got around to this. Great job on it. I mean, it's really very. Great. I mean, I like the way they in a very organized, structured way, broke everything down and listed all the relative items in each given area. So I think as we move through, perhaps we should be looking at things in a more structured way too, and we can this is kind of a map, if you will.
So in that regard, Heather Langford, who was recently selected to be the sustainability director at the county, has taken a position in a similar capacity in Nashville. So they're going to be looking for another director here shortly. And so we're kind of like staffing wise, EPDs assisting in that capacity. And for those of you who may know Forrest Elton, left the EPD and has gone back to work at City of Gainesville, but he's still in the capacity of assisting the CCAC through the city. So we're kind of shifting replacing positions slowly. And so there's kind of a little bit of a gap there for the CCAC to kind of like, stay ahead of their progress.
Thank you, Mark. I didn't know that. That's kind of strange. Someone came, that Heather came just like last year and is leaving.
Right. I think she's been here a year maybe. And so, so yeah, we're having to kind of juggle things around a bit. So we'll see how that falls out.
Well, that's all I had on that particular item, Nisha.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, and I guess, like you said, we can kind of look to this as a resource when we're, looking at our future community conversations and just the kind of things that are on the radar of the CCAC in terms of climate change. So does anybody have anything they'd like to share or any suggested items for next month's meeting? I think we did talk about deciding on our next topic in the new year. So I don't know if that's something we'll do in January, or at least we'll review our topics and start looking at that again.
What would be another, it might just a question for the group, what would be another presentation I think that would be meaningful for us to hear? I really enjoyed Dr. Jack's presentation. I thought it was excellent. And we've all been, especially Bettina and I, have been asking questions regarding this for quite some time and bringing stuff up. So I'm really glad to hear now that we have some expert input and someone to even go to to ask some questions about. But
yeah,
is there another area in which we could benefit by hearing an expert speak to us?
Well, I meant to bring this up for many months, and I don't have the exact title in my head. I know I have touched on it before, and it has to do with roadside mowing. And there's an expert from the Native Plant Society who could explain to us what kind of plants grow on the roadside and why it is important to have them. But as I said, I could send this to all of you, explain a little bit more what they would have to offer, and then maybe we could invite that speaker.
that sounds good, Bettina.
Yeah, I do think it's an important topic. I know we talked about it before, but I think I'm not able to really convey, what the Native Plant Society people have to offer. So, I try to sit down and formulate a paragraph or so and send it to everybody at EPAC.
Yeah, and if we can keep that, those discussions to like a half an hour, I have no problem with hearing from even them, which, that'd be great.
Mark, I know you noted that consultant from Edmund & Jones would be starting next year, but do you know if kind of more of maybe a timeline? I think it would be nice to hear a bit more of the breakdown for that work for EPAC. And then I was also thinking kind of as a second tier, anyway, if there is a public engagement component for that type of consulting work and that analysis, maybe EPAC could kind of formulate our speakers around the sections that maybe they're trying to communicate well to the public, similar to that breakout that David just showed, and kind of engage that way.
You've been reading my mind, Melissa. That's
I can check in on you mean the vulnerability assessment? Is that what you said? Okay. I can check and see if Jones Edmonds they could give a presentation. And Shane Williams of our, he's an engineer. He's gave a presentation to EPAC before in our water resource, is managing that contract. And either him and or Jones Edmonds could probably give a presentation next month if you're interested as to what's in their scope, even though they really haven't gotten started yet. fortunately, there have been other communities in the state that have, over the last year or two, started preparing vulnerability assessments. Fort Lauderdale is one that comes to mind, and as well as St. Augustine. And they're using those as kind of a template, you might say. Of course, there's coastal communities are they have different vulnerability issues, but at least they have a outline of what they're evaluating, and but at least they can give a presentation
grab the vacuum.
to how that would.
I'm gonna
come into
call.
play.
Or would we do better waiting until they've had a little more time to formulate?
Take your slippers off.
That's the other option. You could wait till they have a draft, maybe, which I would hope they would have at least a first round after 6 to 9 months as to what project listings they have in mind. And then the committee could look at those and see if they felt like that there was something where the priorities maybe should shift.
Mark, that sounds good to me. Why don't you check with them and see, where they're at now and when they think they'll be at that point. And then, make them aware that we're interested at a later stage, their development, when they've gotten their feet wet, in the project a bit, to go ahead and give a presentation to us. By the way, I want to, as point of disclosure here.
David, can I jump in really quick?
Go ahead, Scott.
I just wanted to say we are actually part of that Jones Edmonds team. It's broken down in 3 phases, and I don't know exactly how many sub-consultants there are. We are specifically looking at the water resources pieces of it with Jones Edmonds, but there are, I think, another 6 or 7 sub-consultants on that are kind of helping with different pieces of it. My understanding is also kind of early in next year is that it's going to be starting.
So we'd be better off waiting a couple months, or should we go ahead and ask for, someone to present to us now?
All they're probably going to be able to tell you now is kind of what's in the scope.
Right.
There won't be any work done. I mean, the first phase is pretty quick. I think it'll be a while until the entire report is done from that first phase, but that first phase is going to be looking at what has been done in all of these other reports that have been done in various places, and kind of a literature review piece that then goes into, they're going to do a lot of modeling to identify locations that are likely to see impacts. And I mean, there's a lot more in the scope than this. And then the third phase is going to be kind of impact area by impact area, describing what anticipated impacts are based on modeling and best available information.
Well, since you've got eyes on that project, being an insider on that, maybe it's best for us to kind of rely on you to come back and tell us when you think it would be a good time for us to have have someone from them present us.
Yeah, I mean, I would think it'll be, it would definitely be a couple months, I think, but I do think it would be very valuable once that project is kind of underway and moving forward. But right now, I mean, it would be telling you what's in the scope, I think, only.
Excellent. That's kind of what I thought.
And thanks, Scott. I thought Wetland Solutions was on that team, but I didn't want to make that assumption. But no, thanks for clarifying.
No problem. I'm sorry it took me a minute. I dropped the
no.
and have shattered
No, I knew that, like you said, there are several firms on that project.
And I knew Scott, I know you worked for them, but I figured, I'd give you the anonymity of, if you wanted to say something, to speak up, and then of course you did. So, and I'm really grateful that you are here again, as I said, for more than one reason. You do keep us in check when we go off the deep end on various things in a non-scientific way. And the point that I wanted to bring to the group as a point of, I guess, disclosure was that I had talked with the chair of the CCAC about the idea of working with them, EPAC working with them to help in their communication to the community, because they're very concerned about how they're going to communicate to the community, you know, what they're doing and what their progress is and stuff like that. So whether they choose to do that or not is totally up to them, of course. So I don't know what they're going to choose, but, you know, they may come back and say, you know, remember when you made the very foolish offer to help us on this, you know, we're taking you up on it. So, you know, time will tell on that, but I want everyone to be aware that that could happen at some point in time.
Mhm.
It just struck me as being really close to what we're doing with the community conversations anyway, in a way that we could help serve them and the county and the city and all the other cities and municipalities in the county as well.
Yeah, thanks, David. I appreciate you communicating with the CCAC and keeping that kind of brainstorm for collaboration open, because like you said, there's a lot of overlap and shared goals and shared concerns.
My pleasure.
All right, well, does anybody have any other feedback? I know that we've, you know, tossed different ideas around for topics to have speakers on, and I'm looking through my notes trying to find kind of the things that we've discussed in the past, and maybe you know, they'll probably all come to me after we end the meeting. But if anybody does think of anything that they'd like to bring to the next meeting or subsequent meetings, as, you know, topics to cover, I think, you know, generally this group is interested in anything around the environment and learning more, you know, about all the little niches. Bettina, do you have a question? I see Bettina's hand is raised. Well.
I know
I have a
Gus had
question.
invited, Gus, 1 second, please. I know that Gus had invited all of us several times to give feedback on the eco-industrial park and what kind of tenants should be there and how all of that should work. And when, I forgot his name, when this fellow was presenting at the last EPAC meeting about burning waste, and I forgot the term he used, that really worried me because he seems to really be a proponent of plastics.
Yeah.
So I think, you know, I really think it would be good if we as a group, not only individually, but we as EPAC, as a group, spend some time on trying to iron out some criteria that we would like to see companies fulfill when they move into the eco-industrial park.
Yeah,
Like a list of criteria. Okay, so, you know, what do we want to see in companies? What is supposed to happen at that park? I think, you know, this is a great opportunity for us, and it's a real challenge to nail all of that down.
Yeah, I like that, Bettina, and I want to say that Gus is going to be presenting, right, those criteria at a BOCC meeting early next year. Is Gus still on the call? He left, right? He mentioned something like he was going to be presenting you know, a host of things, maybe encompassing that as well. So my concern, I like that feedback, and my concern is just getting him those thoughts with enough time for him to have them before presenting the criteria for companies to the Board of Commissioners.
Yes.
So maybe that's something you know, we shouldn't wait on. And if you think of ideas, to just email him ahead of our next meeting.
You know, Nisha, by the way, I just thought of one other thing, because I know we're running out of, or have run out of time here, is that I thought it might be interesting if we could have someone from Life Soils come back and tell us about their composting plan.
Yeah, I like that. I feel like we've had Life Soils here more than once, or maybe it's just come up a lot. We did have them. We had them once.
They have come up before, but they were only looking around Gainesville at the time, and the areas they were looking for were in the well field zone, so it was not considered appropriate. So then that's when they looked at the Newberry area. There was some old landfill areas there that they felt like was more compatible. I have not seen their concept. I know they've got, something, but I'll check with Gus. One of the things that I know Gus was trying to do with Sean was, you notice that the three presenters for the Eco Park, one of the things that they've been trying to do is work to see how they can integrate the byproducts of each of those industries to assist each other rather than work in a silo and just do their own thing. And so that's one of the things they're looking at in terms of any, interested parties looking at establishing a business there, is how they can actually integrate with each other. So, but yes, Bettina, you're right. If there's some concerns there that the committee wishes to express, you can send them to me and I can pass them on to Gus. And I
Okay.
don't know if any other, as you all know, there's basically, they did the ribbon cutting on the Eco Park, almost 2 years ago. And these are been the first applicants to actually submit something. So there's been a long time of promoting and marketing and trying to get, potential tenants to establish in the park that would be appropriate for that park.
Yeah, and Mark, one of the things I brought up, more than one time to this committee is that the thing about life soils is they kind of fall into one of those places, where they need to take, foodstuffs, for example, as part of their composting, product. And that, we've got restaurants in the area that, need to get rid of their waste that's going into landfill now. And we're county is really trying to cut back their landfill, and put not just plastics and things, but also, food waste. And at the same time, they can use that food waste in the manufacture of their major product, which is, to be used in lawn care instead of, putting down fertilizer, because of the effect, of using a good, healthy compost like they create to help, make lawns healthier, so that they need less water and less fertilizer. They shouldn't be using any, but if they're using the wrong kind of grass, of course, they're going to need the wrong kind of turf. They need to be using that. But so the fact that there is a company in a position to kind of fill multiple, spots, here is a critical thing. And I think if we can, help them, and by listening to them and by, seeing what's going on and supporting their process, I think we're doing good, for the county and for everyone in the county and for the environment at the same time.
Right. Actually, they've been working with IFAS. The county has a contract with IFAS to evaluate different soil amendments for development projects for retention ponds, nutrient uptake. And so one of their components they're evaluating is the use of compost. And that study is currently being conducted on existing stormwater basins, but they are gathering data, I guess, from live soils to evaluate that as another of their box of tools to utilize.
Is it a project Pierce Jones is involved in by any chance?
Yes, I think they're looking at compost as one of those options that for certain developments that might be appropriate to utilize as a soil amendment. And once that study's done, which I think is scheduled for this next summer, they'll use that data to determine what would be appropriate to incorporate in the land development code requirements for subdivision design. So.
Yeah, so we have a few new members who didn't hear the original talk that Life Soils gave. So I like that idea of having them back to present something.
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead, Bruce. Sorry, you did have your hand up for so long.
Yeah, I have a question. I didn't quite get from what Gus said, whether Life Soils is doing what they presented to us, the outside furrows and doing the regular composting, or if they were also seeking permission to build an industrial composting plant there. That would be very interesting to find out if somebody is doing an industrial composting plant. That would change a whole lot around here.
I'll check
Maybe-
and clarify on that. That's a good question, Bruce. I think their facility out in Newberry doesn't include an industrial facility, but they may be doing that now, because I knew they weren't able to do that at their locations they were looking at on 53rd Avenue. So maybe going to Newberry opened up more opportunities out there. But I'll check with them and see if they're willing to give an update on their project.
Thank you.
Hey, Nisha, for January, would it be helpful to have someone maybe from the county update us a little bit on what's happening in the legislature regarding environmental related bills and things like that? Some of us keep up with some of these on our own, but I just wonder if everybody does. There's 2 or 3 that I've been following that were just recently filed that I'm rather concerned about, pertaining to agriculture stuff and nutrient management, fertilizer management, but maybe have somebody sort of give us a view of what's coming.
Yeah, that sounds great. Mark, is there somebody who would be kind of ideal for that?
No, we pretty much filter that out between the different departments based on the topic. We're basically, until session commences, we don't really provide comments. And they do have a lobbyist, I think, that helps assist with that. But there is home rule issues are being challenged again, as has been every year now. But George is right. There are other issues, obviously coming forward. And as Melissa knows from the night, the turnpike, issue, I don't know how that meeting went tonight, but there's a push in Marion County to get, a connector going after the MCORs, died last year on the vine for the 3 toll roads, but now there's a push to have another connector. So yeah, there's a lot happening, but I would suggest maybe February. By that time, we would have a better idea of what's been submitted in the session from the House bills, and we could probably arrange to have somebody give an overview of that. The 1,000 Friends of Florida, Paul Owens that gave the presentation, they do an excellent job of, if you go to their website, they always have, what bills are being proposed, particularly environmental and transportation. And they track the progress of those bills. And that's actually the county, our #1 source for finding out information. So that might be something if you're interested in looking for.
Mark, I'll also just add for that plug for 1,000 Friends, their legislative preview is actually tomorrow.
Okay.
I believe it starts at 1. It's a webinar. It's about an hour and a half. Highly recommend registering for it. For my work, I do a lot of tracking for legislative cycle, and
Right.
yeah, it's gonna be real busy.
Right.
So I would recommend
So-
tuning into that. And if you can't catch it, they always have the recording up.
Right.
Thank you, Melissa.
Yeah, thanks, Melissa. Okay, so it looks like maybe February we can have a legislative sort of update, and then so life soils still a contender for January presentation. Is that something, Mark, that we could potentially have?
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Make sure Pierce Jones is included in that, because he's
Yeah,
he's spoken
Pierce
to
is-
us before.
Pierce has been working with them on their concept plans and stuff. So hopefully he can give a presentation as well.
Great. Sounds good. Anything else? All right, well, we'll go ahead and adjourn. Hope everybody has a happy holiday and see you next year.
Hi, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
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 Bye.